Hello, welcome to Medical Cannabis, a safer alternative to opioids. We're so happy that you guys could all be here. My name is Nishi Whiteley, and I'm the COO of Credo Science. I will be your moderator today. I personally have suffered from chronic pain since I was a little kid, and from the time I was probably 17 to 35 or 40, I lived with severe chronic pain every day. And cannabis was a miraculous discovery for me. So this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart. Over 50 million American adults suffer from chronic pain. That's over 20% of the adult population. The Academy of Sciences has produced a report about cannabis, looking at the evidence about its efficacy and safety. And one of the areas where it has decided that there is sufficient evidence for cannabis use is in the area of chronic pain. What we have seen in the evidence that we have so far is that when we utilize cannabis in tandem with opiates, we are able to reduce the dose of the opiate given, reduce side effects, and the risk of addiction. There are a number of preclinical discoveries that show that the median effective dose of morphine is 3.5 times lower when you're using cannabis with the morphine. So cannabis has the potential to greatly improve a person's experience to pain. We're very lucky today to have such an incredible panel who are going to talk to you about their personal experience in clinical practice. First at the podium will be Dr. Bryon Adinoff, and I have great respect for Dr. Adinoff, who spent 30 years working at the VA. He is a psychiatrist and has also been a professor. Currently, Dr. Adinoff is at the University of Colorado, teaching in the area of psychiatry. When he left the VA, he joined Doctors for Cannabis Regulation and has been an incredible advocate for cannabis law reform. We're very grateful to him for being so accessible to those of us who are working in the grassroots area. He has gone and spoken to legislators. He's also testified on behalf of several of our organizations, Texans for Responsible Marijuana Policy, Foundation for an Informed Texas. And so we're very grateful to have him here today. And he is going to speak to you specifically regarding the risk of addiction and about opioid addiction and the cross-section of cannabis. Our second speaker is Dr. Sue Sisley. Many of you know her as Dr. Sue, and she is a beloved speaker here in Texas and around the country. She is one hell of a cannabis advocate. So she really fights for patient rights, especially veterans. She is an internist and a psychiatrist. She is the founder and the CEO of the Scottsdale Research Institute and was very famously fired from the University of Arizona Medical School for advocating to do this work. So we're very lucky to have her here today. And I just want to also note that in addition to her pioneering cannabis research, she also works in the area of other psychedelics and is really trying to understand, with all of these important plants, how do we put them into practical use in a safe way that's going to help the maximum number of people. Our third speaker today is Dr. Matthew Brimberry. He practices family medicine and also works in the area of palliative care. Dr. Brimberry was one of the first physicians in Texas to get registered to recommend, I almost said prescribe, to recommend cannabis in Texas. And he sees patients online who have a qualifying condition. His company is Texas Cannabis Clinic. And another thing that he does that I really appreciate is he works with Texas OG to provide a monthly webinar to help educate other physicians. So at this time, I hope you will join me in welcoming our esteemed panel. Thank you. So Dr. Adinoff will be the first. Each will talk for 5 to 7 minutes, and then I will lead them in a series of questions, and hopefully we'll have a little time for questions from the audience. So, Dr. Adinoff.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to be back in Texas. And I've been working with Heather a long time on this. As mentioned, I was here for 23 years, most of my career. So I know this has been a long haul for us. As mentioned, I'm president of Doctors for Drug Policy Reform. Our name has been switched, and I didn't switch it. I'm clinical professor of the University of Colorado, Angie's Medical Center. I'm editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse. I'm a consultant for Demorex and Atai Life Sciences that have been developing ibogaine and noribogaine for use in addictions, and I've done some work for the Badger Institute. As mentioned, I'm president of Doctors for Drug Policy Reform. That used to be Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, with a focus just on cannabis. We've expanded our mission to include all drugs and ending prohibition. We're a global voice for licensed health professionals and scientists advocating for evidence-based drug policies and best practices that advance public health, reduce stigma, and minimize harm. And I left some things when you walk in the door that you can look at. I just want to briefly kind of touch on, I don't want to go through these slides actually, on the underlying pharmacology and opioids. They're much different. So they affect pain in much different ways. Cannabis hits CB1 and CB2 receptors. Opioids for pain hit mu opioid receptors. They're in different parts of the brain. They do much different things. They affect the experience of pain both peripherally and centrally in much different ways. Opioids are far more reinforcing, therefore they are more addictive. The data as it is suggests that 1 out of 10 people that use cannabis will develop a problem with cannabis versus 3 out of 10 with opioids. To me, more critical is that people die relatively easily if they have an unregulated dose from opioids. 100,000 people died of drug overdose last year. And in the few years before that, about 2/3 of those were primary opioid versus none with cannabis. So cannabis, because of the way THC hits central nervous system receptors, it does not decrease breathing, and therefore you don't die. There are other consequences that I'll touch on, but those are the key things. What I'd like to spend some time on is the effectiveness of cannabis for what's called for opioid sparing pain. So if you take an opioid for pain and then you take cannabis, how good does it work? Can you get by with a lesser dose? So one way to test this is in clinical translation studies where you use a laboratory, and this is work was by Ziba Cooper at UCLA. And so you stick your hand in a bucket of water, it's very cold, and everyone, if you do it long enough, will feel intense pain and have to take their hand out. So the question is, how long does it take you to feel such pain that you have to take your hand out? So there's a pain threshold in terms of how long does it take you, and then how long does it take you to report pain, and then how long does it take you to actually have to withdraw your hand? So in this study, what they did was they gave the same group in 4 different sessions, either cannabis, THC. Now this is a while ago, so 4 to 6%. That I live in Colorado now. That doesn't even qualify as cannabis, probably. I don't know who would buy it, but anyways, that's what University of Mississippi had at the time for people to use, and then oxycodone. So you either get 2 placebos, you get active cannabis and no oxycodone, or placebo oxycodone, oxycodone, placebo cannabis, or both together. All right. The circle is when you get both. Now, it's low doses of cannabis and oxycodone, so you don't see any effect. The 3 different, let's see, there's a couple triangles and a open circle at the bottom, and it shows no change over time. So nothing works. But when you put the cannabis and the oxycodone together, you get a really dramatic increase in time to when you report pain and not shown how long it takes you to take your hand out. So this is a nice example of how the 2 together, working by different mechanisms in different parts of the brain, can have a potentiating effect. As Nishi was just saying, this is looking at meta-analysis of all the studies done looking at this question in different population. In preclinical trials, if you have THC on board, you can get by with 3.5-fold less opioid. And this is in preclinical rodent and non-human primate studies. That's a very powerful finding, but it's in animals. It's in non-humans. Looking at experimental pain studies like the one I just mentioned, it's mixed. Some, like Dr. Cooper's, showed a dramatic effect. Others showed no effect. Some showed the opposite. Randomized trials, controlled trials, our so-called gold standard, with cancer pain, found no effect of cannabinoid administration on opioid dose. So that was a wash. Controlled chronic non-cancer pain trial reported reduced pain scores with cannabinoids. So different from cancer versus non-cancer. Randomized controlled trials found no treatment effect with dronabinol or Marinol. And observational studies where you just follow people for a long time. Maybe you give them some opioid and some cannabis. Maybe you just watch. They're on opioids and they're on their own, taking different kinds of cannabis. In those studies, there was a marked reduction in both opioid use and many people who stopped opioid. So we have dramatic difference depending on what kind of studies we look at. I think for me, some light is shed on this with this really nice meta-analysis. It was, I was real proud that it was published in the journal that I'm editor of. The impact of cannabis on non-medical opioid use among individuals receiving pharmacotherapies for opioid use disorder. So these are people who are in treatment for opioid use disorder. And they are, almost all of them are getting either Suboxone or methadone. And then looking to see, how much opioids are they using when they're illegal opioids are they using when they are also using on their own cannabis. And what they found was there was no difference amongst all these different trials. Now, that doesn't mean nobody changed. What it means to me is somebody used more, somebody used less. So what we're seeing is I think these controlled trials are looking en masse at responses, when in fact, in this group, when I come here, I hear these heartwarming stories about how cannabis is helpful. When I go to a psychiatric conference, I hear very scary stories about the terrible things cannabis does. So I think it's very individual, and it depends on who you're listening to and who you're talking to. So I'll end with that, and we can hone down on that a little bit more in the Q&A.
Okay.
Wonderful to be with you guys. Let me see here. You think this is mine, huh?
It is.
Okay, perfect. Sue Sisley, I'm a primary care doc from Arizona, she said, and Nishi brought up the fact that I was, that's Dodger. He's our facility doc at the lab. She mentioned that I had been fired from U of A, which I have to admit is probably my proudest professional achievement, because it's hard when you're an academic to stand up to these big institutions that are doing wrong. And I think that we were, it was very successful. We were conducting an FDA approved government-funded clinical trial, but the U of A did not like the optics of that. It didn't want veterans smoking weed on campus, and the president found a way to terminate me and our grant. But like I said, we've managed to be, we're happily independent now, functioning in a private nonprofit laboratory in Phoenix, where we manufacture our own cannabis flower. Now we farm our own natural psilocybin mushrooms and peyote plants, and being independent of universities and hospitals is actually really valuable, and I think makes us more efficient. I bring this up because in relation to this topic, I want to just show you examples of some of these studies that have already been conducted. So we've got piles of legitimate research, hundreds of controlled trials studying cannabis for treating pain and reducing opioid dependence. And this is a study that we had done. I was working with University of Michigan, and we were collecting observational data on how the patients in Michigan were using cannabis to not just reduce or eliminate their opioid use, but also eliminate a lot of other pharmaceuticals, a lot of very addictive prescriptions like sleep aids, like Ambien, benzos, things like that. So there was a huge substitution effect that was really impressive. I just want to, I'm not going to make you, I'm not going to torture you with all this data, but I just wanted to give you a glimpse of the massive amount of studies that are already out there talking about this dynamic. And then, of course, you've got the pharmacoeconomic side here, this article pointing out that the opioid prescription, the cost of paying for opioids also drops in states where cannabis is legal. This was another study that we did with U of M, Mark Ware's study. We were fortunate to have the Dr. Gupta on CNN highlight this in Weed 4. So you can see the amount, just the groundswell of data and media coverage. You would think that we would be a lot further along, but I want to just point out something, especially for Texans. I am amazed that you guys have a $3 billion opioid settlement fund here in your home state that is, unparalleled by almost, like in Arizona, we have a lot, we have $1 billion, but you guys have $3 billion that was negotiated, and it continues to grow, right? Because these settlements are still coming in, like Sackler family still hasn't finished their negotiation. So my point to you, what I was hoping to convey today is that there is something really frustrating about the way these opioid monies are being distributed, is that they're claiming that only evidence-based treatments can be supported, right? So the only thing that is being funded right now in these various states is Suboxone, methadone, and 12-step. And I'm not going to disparage those, even though I have, I started out as an addiction doc, and I was writing tons of prescriptions for Suboxone for 20 years. And that is a very imperfect drug. Let me say, it's a very frustrating experience. And that's why I had to start doing this work, because I felt so strongly that cannabis offers a much better exit ramp for people to get off opioids and Suboxone or methadone ever would. But my point is that there is so much published data on cannabis for reducing opioid dependence and potentially, providing long-term symptom control for that. But your opioid settlement funds are not going to go to this. And I think that this is something you should be aware of, that you can fight for. You can change that dynamic. It's not too late. These $3 billion or whatever, you may end up with $4 billion in the next year. That money is allocated over 18 years. So there's potential that you can change the course of this by pushing. One of the things in the opioid settlement agreement is that you are allowed to fund research with that money. And, I would argue that, using cannabis for opioid dependence is already evidence-based, but not according to their parameters. So you could argue that we should be spending, allocating some of that funding to do even more controlled trials to understand how to best utilize this medicine. And I wanted to point out, in our state, right, this is our governor, Ducey, who didn't like this dynamic of, cannabis. Was really a lot of opioid dependent patients are using cannabis in Arizona. And we even had clinics that were teaching patients, like, how to do this successfully. Okay, patient comes in on huge amount of opioids for 20 years. How do you, at least balance it, maybe help them reduce their daily amount. But we still have this stigma, clearly, that governors are worried. Oh yeah, the governors are worried about how to are worried about the optics of this. And I'll just leave this here because I wanted to say that I think one of the challenges we have in these states where, like in Arizona, we had almost 400,000 medical marijuana patient card holders. And when we got rec approved 2 years ago, those patients dwindled to under 30,000 card holders now. So we had a really dramatic reduction. So I want to point that out. If you're thinking about adult use, you got to just be aware that your medical market is going to disintegrate very quickly. But the reason I bring it up is because when the medical market was thriving for 10 years in Arizona, we had a lot of clinics where people were going, and this is why I brought up this study, because this is a case report in how to the logistics of how patients can reduce their opioid dependence using cannabis. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have, is let's figure out how to operationalize this process for people, because right now it's still sort of an intangible. People are trying to do this on their own and often struggling. And so case reports like this hopefully can evolve into controlled trials where we can develop protocols for people to study how they can, the specific roadmap for how patients can tackle this in their own lives. And hopefully you can use your opioid settlement funds to pay for that kind of research. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much.
All right. Good morning, guys. My name is Matthew Brimberry. Can you hear me okay? All right. I am a family physician, like she said, but I'm also a fellow of the American Academy of Hospice and Palliative Medicine and a certified hospice medical director. And I've been doing palliative care for over 10 years. I am the medical director for the Austin Geriatric Palliative Care Team, where we go out into the nursing homes, into the homes of these patients that can't make it into clinic to help them with their chronic conditions. This meeting's about our opioid, or is cannabis safer as an alternative to opioids? In Texas, we do not have chronic pain as one of the diagnoses that we can prescribe cannabis for. It's a shame. So what do we see out there with other states that have led us? I love Bryon's. He's bringing really good studies and presenting them. When I was looking at the literature, there's a study out of Canada where they took patients and as they were introduced to the dispensary and cannabis, and they followed them for 6 months, and they found 70%, they found a 70% reduction in their opioid prescriptions. But I didn't like that study because as we're all researchers here, they start off with 1,600 patients and they lost 800. And when you have a study where you lose 800 patients, what happened to them? So let's turn to Delaware. This is a little bit more realistic. In 2019, when they certified patients for chronic pain and allowed them into their dispensaries, they maintained this study, kept the patients, and they found that they reduced their opioids by 30%, which comes to what do I see in practice? When I get somebody initiated on medical cannabis with their target to be reducing pain as one of their secondary goals, because I can't prescribe it for that, I usually see about a 30 to 50% reduction with their opioid intake. Well, why are they even on opioids? It's because the World Health Organization, as clinicians, they tell us for non-cancerous pain, there's a step ladder. You got to start low. You got to start with your Tylenol, your Motrin. And then step 2 is, oh, you're still in pain, try some partial opioid antagonists. We call them tramadol. Third step, interventions like nerve blocks and then some mild opioids. And then you get up to where we swim in the palliative care realm with the strong opioids. And then that's when we introduce cannabis and we see a reduction. It seems like cannabis should come in a little bit sooner than that. If we're seeing a reduction, we don't have to prescribe those medicines. If we think about the pain pathways, how does cannabis work? My colleagues here touched on it. There's 2 types of pain. There's acute pain, where if you put your hand in a cold water, you reach a pain threshold and, oh, and I feel pain. And then later on, it's too much, you have to take your hand out. We call that nociceptive pain. There are peripheral cannabinoids that you can use for nociceptive pain. What we're dealing with chronic pain is when that, and this is an electrical signal that goes from the body pain to the brain, is at that synapse, you have a dysregulation of those neurotransmitters. And Dr. Russo, you've talked about the deficiency of the endocannabinoid system. One of the components in chronic pain is theorized that there's a decrease in endocannabinoids. So imagine you're at Olive Garden and you have a salad and the waitress is grating cheese. That's the cheese grater is delivering neurotransmitters to your brain. If you can't tell that cheese grater to stop, it's going to keep going up and up. Cannabinoids are a unique compound that retroactively go from the brain back across that synapse to tell the rest of the molecules, stop. It's a unique, very safe pathway. And one of my favorite studies that was released as a meta-analysis was with Jason Bousset. And so we heard about a study that they used cannabis, Percocet, and placebo. He did a meta-analysis to where he found a lot of studies with opioids and placebo, and he found a lot of studies with cannabis and placebo, and he did a meta-analysis using the placebo as a commonality. And he found that both opioids and cannabis reduce pain by about 10%. But on reading the study, you realize that cannabis was just as effective. It had decreased risk and decreased side effects, meaning that going back to that WHO ladder, it reinforces it should really be more step 1. I'm going to stop with this. So we have a palliative care advisory council through the Texas Health and Human Services. And on August 6th, Dr. Fine from Dallas declared at that meeting that if the pain is opioid deserving, then it should be cannabis deserving pain, with cannabis probably being the safer drug. We don't have chronic pain as a diagnosis that we can prescribe for. I'm going to end with this. 45 minutes ago, I was standing outside there and I got a call from my hospice nurse at the bedside. I have a patient with pulmonary fibrosis. His lungs are scarred. He's been my patient for 5 years. He doesn't qualify for the program. And I got him onto hospice 3 weeks ago. He's got back pain. I've got him on a tremendous amount of steroids to decrease the inflammation in his lungs. She asked, what should we do for his back pain? I can't give him anti-inflammatories because he's on steroids. My hands are tied. I want to give him cannabis, but he doesn't meet the program's criteria. I initiated a opioid, knowing full well that if we go down that slippery slope and I have to increase it, I'm going to decrease his respiratory drive and I'm going to hasten his death. They shouldn't hand tie us like that. And we should be making the decisions for our patients.
Thank you, everyone. That was great. All right.
To the audience.
All right. So in preparation for this, I did some reading this morning. Years ago, I had the pleasure of attending a conference, and one of the topics was this very topic. And there was a father-daughter team of researchers that presented some truly staggering statistics about what happens in the Medicare Part D program when a medical cannabis program is instituted in a state. So I just want to share these really interesting statistics with you. So, and these are old statistics. So I'm sure that you guys can imagine what they would be if we had actually updated statistics. And Dr. Brimberry touched on this. So from 2010 to 2015, there were 23.08 million daily doses of opioids that were dispensed per year, on average per state. So regression analysis showed that in states where there was an active medical cannabis law, there was a reduction of 3.742 million fewer daily doses in the active medical cannabis states. This is significant. One of the things that all of us are probably sick and tired of hearing is, oh, well, we need more research. We need more evidence. And the other thing that we hear about is the risk for addiction. Dr. Adinoff spent 30 years working with the VA, seeing patients every day. And so I'd like to ask Dr. Adinoff 2 questions. First is, in your patient population, how common was it that you would see a patient with cannabis use disorder as their primary indication?
Oh, is there primary?
Yes.
I just didn't see it.
And how often would you see it otherwise?
That's a little trickier because one of the things I would work with the medical students is I would see cannabis use disorder on their problem list. And I said, tell me about their cannabis use. They said, well, they're smoking like a joint a day. Well, use is not the same as use disorder. So what kind of problems? Was it out of control? Well, not that I know of. Did they compulsively use? Did they have any problems from it? Well, I don't know. They were, smoking a gram of cocaine or drinking a case of beer a day. So not that I know of. And I said, well, but did they smoke cigarettes? Yeah. Well, that's probably going to kill them. It's not on your problem list. So those were more the kind of issues. I was, if I can tell a quick anecdote, a friend of mine was in the ICU. And so I was visiting them and they were resting. I was working on my Doctors for Drug Policy Reform stuff. And the nurse saw me working on it. And he started talking to me about it. He said, let me show you something. And breaking all sorts of HIPAA rules, he took me around the ICU from one room to the next and said, okay, this one's here from IV drug abuse. This one's here from smoking. This one's here, end-stage liver disease. And went around the whole place. He said, I've been here 20 years, never seen anybody up here for cannabis use disorder.
Thank you. And on the flip side of that, you see a lot of patients who have opioid addiction. And have you seen any of them benefit from reducing their opioid intakes or to completely get off of opiates by using cannabis?
No, and that's probably not something I would have been aware of. My best example is Peter Grinspoon, Lester Grinspoon, who wrote the first medical textbook really on cannabis and medical. Anyways, he's very well known in this space, and he suffered from opioid use disorder, got arrested at work by the feds, and really got off with cannabis. So people do it, but it's primarily anecdotal. I mean, that's how we're hearing about this kind of stuff.
Thank you. All right. So my next question is for Dr. Sisley. You made a very powerful statement about the opioid agreement, the settlement agreement. And I think it's troubling that the requirement is that it has to be used with evidence-based solutions. The National Academy of Science lists chronic pain as having significant evidence. What's it going to take for us to qualify to get access to that money for better use? What kind of evidence are they requiring?
Yeah.
What's it going to take?
That's the big question. And I think that their standard is it has to be an FDA approved treatment. So you have to go through the entire drug development process, which we know could take, over $1 billion, 20 years. And, the problem is that cannabis research in this country has definitely been impeded by the fact that we've only had that one supplier at University of Mississippi for all these decades. Only recently did we break that monopoly. We'll probably, Ethan and I hopefully will talk about this in the afternoon session. But now we finally have access to real world cannabis for FDA clinical trials. And the problem is that, most of the studies that you see, even though they've been able to show evidence of efficacy, even with this suboptimal cannabis from the government and the pharma company, Sativex and these groups have been able to show efficacy. But imagine what could happen if we were allowed to use real world, robust cannabis in, legitimate controlled trials and go through the FDA process with that study drug. It could make a world of difference. I mean, I guess we have to see and look at the data, but, I think all of us, common sense tells us that having rich, highly enriched with terpenes, that type of flower, not diluted with stems, sticks, and leaves, is going to be a better option. So anyway, that's one thing, but I guess the issue is that until, Suboxone and methadone are the chosen targets for opioid settlement money because they have FDA approval. And until we get cannabis, whole plant cannabis through that process, or some version of that, maybe some isolated molecules through the process, we're not going to be considered an evidence-based product, which is really unfortunate. But
So as a proponent for studying inhaled cannabis, I wanted to give you an opportunity to address how you see inhaled cannabis as an alternative to an opiate for pain.
Oh, I mean, I'm so impressed with the efficacy of inhaled cannabis so far, especially when it's real world cannabis. Even the government cannabis was still performing fairly well, despite the government's best efforts to ruin, to sabotage it. So yeah, I think there's definitely, the reason we work with inhaled cannabis is just because it mimics what the real world use is, especially in our veteran population, which is what most of our studies focus on, is veterans and firefighters now. So the inhaled cannabis is just, it's so easy to titrate and get to that sweet spot where people can feel pain relief without feeling overly intoxicated. And it's so easy for people to manage, and it's just a preferred method. We typically study both smoked and vaporized flower because we want to give people options so they don't have to use inhaled products of combustion if they don't want to. And we think that both should be available to people, though, because smoking is a legitimate delivery method and often super effective for people. But yeah, I think that I wanted to mention too, besides just the opioid settlement fund, Texans have the incredible opportunity to take advantage of a $20 billion budget surplus. I mean, every other state in this country is dealing with severe deficits, but Texas is in this unique situation where you guys have all this oil and gas surplus that suddenly manifested last year, and a $20 billion surplus is sitting in your state legislature along with a $3 billion, almost $4 billion opioid settlement fund. So now is the time for you guys, any of you who are activists like me and enjoy pushing the government to do the right thing. I would go for this right now and start talking to your electeds and letting them know that you want, because they are searching for ways to spend that money. I mean, this
Can help.
yeah, this surplus is real and palpable, and you guys can go after it immediately.
Thank you so much. Dr. Brimberry, you see a lot of patients and obviously are very passionate about cannabis being a first-line treatment. Can you talk to us a little bit about what trends you see in your own patient population that are utilizing cannabis, and how would you like the Texas program to be different to give you more space to actually practice medicine?
Thank you. That's a good question. 60% of my time I spend in primary care. And when I'm talking to patients about their ailments, if cannabis is appropriate, I will put it on the table with the rest of the treatment modalities. And my patients know this about me. Yesterday, I had a gentleman who's asked me about going down to the Delta 8 shop, and I had to tell him, I cannot condone you doing this. You have no certifiable condition, but he's been smoking 2 joints a day for his entire life. He's looking for some relief from his anxiety and his insomnia, and he wanted to get away from smoking. I would like to see the program mature to where, but right now it's backwards. You go out into the recreation space and you get a 100 milligram Delta 9 brownie, and you go into the medical space and my patients can't get concentrated medicine if they have pancreatic cancer, and they end up taking too much oil and hurting themselves. So I'd like to see some maturity on the medical side to trust the practitioners on what they're doing with their patients, and to also allow the program to grow so that the physicians can determine if a woman with endometriosis may be able to utilize a safe and natural medicine that isn't going to inhibit her fertility in both a fast-acting, safe way, like a vaporization, and a long-acting edible. That's what I'd like to see.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we have approximately 10 more minutes, and I have a ton of questions for these guys, but I suspect you guys may have some as well. And so I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask a question or two. So do we have anyone that has a burning question on this topic? Yes, sir. And then Piper, I'll go to you on the front row, please. And I'm going to repeat. Okay, thank you, Dr. Brimberry.
Hi, thanks. Ooh. I'm David Aronson. I spend a lot of time around the country educating health professionals about cannabis, and I appreciate all the work that you guys do. One thing that I see all the time and that I'm always having to dispel, and I'm wondering if you if any of this is coming up in your research, that cannabinoids aren't cannabis. And so we see an early study that says, cannabis is effective at 4 to 6% THC, but we're also not looking at the other 400 whatever chemicals that are in there that also have anti-inflammatory and pain-killing properties. And so we know mixed cannabis and whole plant concoctions are more effective, but we only end up measuring 1 or 2 things. And so I'm just wondering, how are you guys tackling that in your research? Because sort of this thing that everybody knows, it's there, but nobody can point it out and find it. And then we get studies on Marinol that show it's ineffective, but that's only one chemical component of the thing that actually works.
Yeah, I think, do you want to talk first? Okay.
Yes, Sue's probably better, but I have something to say about it. The last slide I showed with the observational studies, you don't know what kind of cannabinoids were in there. It could be some of these are CBD studies, which is completely different. You don't know what terpenes, you don't know what flavonoids. And I think the way hopefully we're going with this, having lunch a couple of days ago with Dave and Valencourt from S3 Collective, and they are pulling together these massive databases from private companies, from the industry. And is anyone familiar with tetragram? I didn't know about it until 2 days ago. And it is this system where it's an app. You have to actually purchase it. And you put in how much you're using, what are your indications, what strain it is, because there's 800 chemobars, and all this information, and then follow it over time. And then you connect that with the database of what people are using. They have vapes now that are Bluetooth, so they can measure exactly how often you're taking, how much you're inhaling, over what length of time. And then if you look at their genotype and to see who is more responsive genetically to one specific cannabinoid versus another, I think that is the only way to get at some of these questions. And then there's the taxonomy that I think is going on now, that, or this afternoon when I'm speaking, it sounds very interesting. So then how do you make it simpler? So for instance, there's now 3 chemotypes, and then you can separate those each into 5 different subtypes. And to try and get a handle on this massive amount of data that is being generated clinically.
Yeah, I'll just, our charity was built around this idea that nature is the best technology. And we think that studying whole plant and whole mushroom is a superior approach than isolating molecules. That's probably because we're a nonprofit. So we're not trying to patent medicines and take it to FDA approval. We're just trying to understand more about what nature has already provided us. And, we know that these plants are loaded with different molecules. Some of them have been characterized. Some of them are still waiting to be understood. But in the meantime, why not study the whole plant, what people are actually benefiting from every day, and get that data? And part of the challenge is, remember, for 53 years, we've been required to use University of Mississippi cannabis, which was very anemic and probably didn't have the robust entourage of molecules that we, that the real world enjoys. And that's changing, thankfully. Mississippi stepped up their game. We're growing good cannabis now, and hopefully getting to use it in a study soon. But until we can do the studies with real world flower, we're not really going to be able to prove your point either, which is my point too. We all have, I think, a similar hypothesis, but we haven't been able to show that yet. And I'll bring up in the research panel this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the fact that the first time we're finally able to use real world cannabis in a trial, we've been blocked by the FDA now. We're on clinical hold for 4 years because this is the first time they've ever seen an IND application for robust real world flower. And they are tormented by this. The FDA doesn't know what to do, so they keep rejecting it. And it's really aggravating. It's a fully funded study. We'll talk about it this afternoon.
Howdy, my name's Clay Moore. I'm a PhD student here at Texas A&M University, and I have a question for the entire panel. Our current teacup program is limited to 1% THC by end product. Do you, as medical doctors, believe that this is not a proper way of handling our THC dosing, and how we should, if so, do you think we should change it, and how do we go about changing it?
I think it's too high.
I'll start off.
He said he thinks it's too high. Just kidding.
Number one, I'm seeing the evolution of this program. I can't tell you that I'm just thrilled that we have it in Texas. There was a time when I'd walk into a patient's house and they'd be using cannabis and they have no idea where they're getting it from. And now I can actually get them into a program and get them safe, legal access to isolates. 1% is too low, and we shouldn't be measuring it by percentage. We prescribe things in milligrams. Okay. And some people just need 1 or 2 milligrams. Other people need 100. And when you're limited by a percentage, the volume is the difference there. And it can really make or break somebody's experience and if they're going to respond.
All right, I have a follow-up question to that. So for people who are going to utilize cannabis either instead of opiates or are going to use it in tandem, what advice do you have for them to begin? And how do you encourage them to escalate a dose if they need that?
I'll take this one. Just this is my daily practice when I'm initiating cannabis with somebody that's on long-term opioids. Need to set clear goals on what their pain level needs to be. We need to address the side effects that they're having with the opioids. And then we usually reduce the opioids by about 25% when we initiate the cannabis at a low dose. And low dose typically being 2.5 milligrams twice a day with 5 milligrams at nighttime. And then we readdress, see where we're at. If we made any progress, we continue to reduce those opioids and increase the cannabis until we either entertain side effects on the cannabis side as we down-regulate the receptors and increase the tolerance of that cannabis product until we get to where their goals were initially set. Do we see failures? Occasionally. Some people cannot take edibles. It's been theorized around 20% of people will not get benefit from edibles. They need to use transdermal suppositories or inhalation. We don't have inhalation. We did have suppositories there for a while. We don't have transdermal. Other people are just non-responders. Maybe they have a hyperfunctioning enzyme that just breaks down the cannabinoids, but that's only about 1%.
Okay, so that brings up another very important question. For the people who are non-responders, do you think that they are not having an experience where they are feeling, is it that they're not benefiting from pain relief or they aren't feeling the effects? Because I think
The second,
okay.
they do feel the effects. They get to a level where they don't feel comfortable. They feel a little inebriated and their pain hasn't gone away. We don't see it very often. I say 1%. That's just based on my practice of over 10,000 patients. It's probably less than that.
Right. And based on each of your clinical experience, a lot of people think, oh, well, if you're using cannabis, you're going to be high and somehow you're altered. Do you see a lot of your patients responding at very low doses and not being altered? They're cognitively able to go through their daily life?
I think that's the big surprise is how little people need to have to experience some efficacy. So that's why introducing tiny amounts initially, and especially I would use different delivery methods. Like you said, not everybody can tolerate the metabolite from edible formulation. So if you can use inhaled flower and other, delivery, even topicals seem to be working great for a lot of people. They seem to get absorbed pretty well. So I would just, I think though that's the message. People think that they got to buy the highest dose of what and try to really I think people are often surprised if they start with the smallest, go up carefully, and just journaling and, keeping track of how they're doing is really crucial. And I was going to say this is really interesting. His own clinic is a great place to start this kind of research that we were talking about, because he's already doing this work, and it'd be incredible to be able to get IRB approval up front and start documenting his patient experiences. And
Yeah. Well, our next, we're going to have to wrap up here. We're heading into lunch with the keynote, but our next speaker is going to be talking in part about things beyond THC and CBD. And one of the things that we are learning in our research of cannabigerol is that it is very effective in assisting with pain. And I think that as we go forward in time, the research is going to bear out that the cannabis plant has so much to offer us beyond THC and CBD for pain treatment. And it'll be interesting when we have this conference next time to see where the research has taken us and how that's bearing out in clinical practice. So it'll be fun to do this panel another time. So I invite you all to join us in the ballroom for lunch, and thank you for coming. Let's give our panel a round of applause.